Hello and welcome. This is the next episode in the series about Plato. If you haven't watched that video, I would recommend go watch that first. It gives a bit of a context, some foundations about Plato, and we really leave off before we get into Socrates. So this video is going to highlight about Socrates, the Greek Enlightenment period. So we're going to go through all that information. Again, if you haven't watched the video beforehand, I'll put it in the video description for you to check out. So we'll kind of just jump right into things. So to kind of give you an outlook on what we're going to be going through in today's video, we're going to be talking about, who Socrates really was. People think he was a professor or an author. So we'll really kind of pinpoint who Socrates was, what he actually did. So we'll talk about how he, questioned people publicly. He exposed false confidence in people. And in saying that, why people really followed him. What was the reason for people really wanting to hear what he had to say? We'll talk about, obviously, the death of Socrates. So it's going to talk about, why powerful people ended up hating him and really ultimately had charges against him. We'll talk about, corrupting the youth and obviously the lack of belief in the gods and piety. The trial, the execution we'll talk about, and then why all of this really shatters Plato's worldview. So we'll get kind of started right away. So sometime during Plato's early adult years, Plato crosses path with an individual by the name of Socrates. So this meeting impacted Plato both intellectually and morally as well as a human being. Socrates wasn't a modern day, educator as we would see as like a professor. So he had no official title or position. He also didn't receive compensation for his work. He didn't write any books. Obviously, we don't really have any texts from him other than through Plato, nor were there any lectures that were attributed to him. So all we really know about Plato or Socrates is what was written from the people during that time who witnessed him, who obviously remember him, and really we use that to really capture his influence to, the early Greek philosophers. So Socrates spent all of his time really engaged in dialogue in public forums. So we talked about Athenian direct democracy, how things were governed back then. He appeared in markets, in gymnasiums, workshops, and gatherings with people. So Socrates really had a habit to engage with anybody that he could find a conversation with. So whoever he could find, in the marketplace, he would start kind of questioning them. Now, his line of questioning, his inquiry, his way of inquiry, was straightforward and really rigorous. That we call the Socratic method, if you've heard that before. So Socrates would ask you questions. He'd ask you what you believe, and then he would ask you to explain why you believe it. And you would obviously explain it to him. And then he would finally ask you to prove what you said is claimed to be true. So I know I kind of a rough overview of the Socratic method, but that's a bit in short of what it was. When Socrates followed, a person claiming to have knowledge of something, so maybe they were an expert, he would ask them for the definitions of terms that were being used by that person. So he would examine the implications of these terms or claims, and then he would follow through each conclusion with steps. Eventually, after repeated questioning from Socrates, there was usually a common trend that would conclude from this. So what would happen was, at first glance, powerful people who were experts, they would speak of justice, of courage, of virtue, maybe of leadership, of wisdom, with a lot of confidence and authority. So you can imagine in today's modern terms, there's, or modern times, there's people in, political office, celebrities, quote unquote gurus, uh, authors, people in positions like lawyers, engineers, doctors, people in finance, in tech, whatever, in every path of life where there is some sense of expertise within their field. You can imagine how similar, how we can relate that back into modern terms. So when Socrates would continue questioning, he would find, and usually, he did this in front of a public setting, the confidence of this person who supposedly was an expert in that specific field or concept, their confidence would start to kind of unravel. They started to kind of show that they weren't really that confident or sure about themselves. So, maybe definitions they started using at the start didn't really make sense anymore. Maybe contradictions emerged. And that certainty that first started kind of ended up just being very confusing for maybe people watching and hearing. So it's pretty important to note that Socrates questioned people to really explore their ignorance. So this wasn't for the sake of like entertainment. He wasn't some entertainer trying to make a joke or comedy out of people's expertise that was really not expertise. It was more so to reveal the dangers of the unexamined life. His purpose primarily was ethically based. So he felt that we had an obligation as humans to. He felt that the most significant obligation of human was to care for their souls. So he felt that living according to false beliefs, so having confidence in something that you don't really know or understand or maybe even believe in, corrupts your character. So, he felt that ignorance was being masqueraded as knowledge, and that distorted judgment, not only for themselves, but also people watching. Again, like I mentioned, a lot of these people were in power, so they had great influence and they were persuasive. And he felt that no one should claim to possess authority regarding anything until they understood what they represented. So obviously with this, it attracted a lot of many followers. So, it's said that a lot of young men gathered around Socrates to really witness these conversations. They listened to him and they started trying to take his method of questioning for their own lives and their own conversations. Many of these young men came from influential families. So, they came from maybe powerful or maybe well-known families. And these young men watched with great interest. Obviously, there's a lot of embarrassment. Socrates would kind of break apart people's arguments who were respected figures of Athens. Who they had often admired, and they saw that they were really struggling with Socrates' line of questioning. So they saw obviously these reputations being weakened. They saw the public confidence being a bit undermined. You can imagine if you were a young man and you're seeing some statesmen that were getting questioned, and maybe they make decisions or lead an army or whatever the case may be, and they're kind of getting unraveled in terms of question. Maybe they're beat red and they don't know how to answer. You could see how that could impact the broader landscape of society. So the experiences obviously were thrilling, and Socrates demonstrated a lot of intellectual courage. This man who kind of just walked around and started kind of figuring out people's ignorance, and he didn't really care who it was. He just wanted to get to the truth. Plato was one of those young men who was drawn to Socrates. So Plato obviously saw Socrates with an extraordinary level of integrity that he had not really seen before. So he valued truth. He saw someone who was willing to put themselves out there, and obviously to his detriment, as we later know what happens, to inquire, to reveal people's ignorance. So he would question politicians, question generals, question craftsmen, poets, and all of these inquiries really diminished authority. So you could see how that could really impact the society. So ultimately, it brought a lot of animosity towards Socrates, and it ended up developing into obviously formal charges against him. So, like I mentioned at the start of the video, the first charge was corrupting the youth. This charge obviously reflected the idea that Socrates was encouraging young people, the next generation, to question traditional values, to challenge authority, to reject conventional standards of what success looked like. It reflected a fear that his influence was undermining the obedience, loyalty, and really the social order of Athens. So the second charge was impiety. So this was a lack of respect shown to the gods, in simplest terms. So this was a time that religious expressions were very intertwined with the functioning of the state itself. This was festivals, rituals, myths. These were all common and provided some sense of unity and shared meaning between the citizens. His rejection of the stories of the gods, as being maybe immoral or irrational. He had a lot of emphasis on reason and order and morality. So this created a lot of doubt, obviously, like I said, in terms of society. Like, seeing this guy who's not only breaking apart the arguments of the most powerful people, but he's also not believing in the gods, the festivals, all this stuff. You're kind of looking at yourself like, what am I doing then? Like, if this guy's kind of unraveling all this stuff and that politician can't answer his questions and they're voting or kind of managing this city, what am I doing? Or the city state, So they viewed him as someone who undermined the virtues of individuals and really disrupted, obviously, the social and political balance. So it's said, obviously, Socrates was brought before the court of law, and the court hearing was composed of citizens. Prosecutors presented their case, and this was where Socrates had the right to present his defense. So back then, within the state, like, there weren't really lawyers that would represent you. So if you were brought to court, you represented yourself. Going back to my first video, I talked about rhetoric being a huge part of Plato's inquiry. Rhetoric was huge. If you knew how to structure arguments effectively and you were persuasive, that could mean the difference between life or death for you. So it was hugely important. And you can imagine people that weren't taught in rhetoric or weren't persuasive, weren't educated, you could see, there was no balance, right? If you were brought to court, you had no idea, right? Like, you were definitely getting put to death. So Socrates has the right to present his defense. But Socrates doesn't, try to plead with them or, try to kind of persuade them, so to speak. He doesn't rely on emotional connection or trying to plead for his innocence. He speaks pretty candidly, apparently. He claims that his inquiry is a service to the city-state. He believes that, obviously, the examination of life is a necessary component of human dignity. Ultimately, Socrates is found guilty by the court, and his punishment is, of course, death. So, he receives this charge of punishment, and he refuses to take any type of advantage of escape. He remains faithful to his principles to the very end. So he's executed by poisoning. Obviously, there is the famous painting of the death of Socrates. Plato was present during the trial, but he was not present during the actual execution. So Plato would have been a member of Socrates' circle of friends, acquaintances, and is, frequently represented as one of his closest friends in the dialogues of Plato. So Socrates is very much involved in the stories, the Platonic dialogues. Plato is pretty explicit on it in Phaedo, the dialogue that describes the last days and execution of Socrates. And Plato wrote several dialogues that describe the trial, the apology, of course, the immediate aftermath of the trial, Credo, and the execution, Phaedo, of Socrates. So obviously the execution had a profound impact on Plato. As we know, Plato witnessed a man who, again, was devoted to the pursuit of truth and then was condemned by the majority through public judgment. It was very confusing for him. It shaped his beliefs. He reflected on the limitations of democratic society and judgment, about the connection between knowledge and power. How someone could be in power with really little knowledge of what they're quote unquote experts on. And really consider whether truth can survive in those positions of power where persuasion is used, rhetoric is used rather than true understanding or seeking truth. Can truth really be in that? So, his writings reflect the influence of this event when he discusses in the Republic, for instance, of justice or education or leadership. He views it really as a structural failure of what happened to Socrates within the society that he lived in. And, he concludes a large part of his thoughts that a society incapable of recognizing wisdom will inevitably destroy it. Persuasive power rhetoric is devoid of understanding or seeking truth will lead to catastrophes, as he later talks in the Republic of Tyranny, Oligarchy, and democracy and the steps to tyranny. So from that moment on, obviously, his work becomes an effort to really understand how such an event could have occurred. And that is a mission, obviously, that defines the remaining years of his life. Now, before we kind of get into the weeds, so to speak, of concepts from Plato, we do need to kind of zoom out on the Greek Enlightenment period. So we're going to kind of shift gears here and kind of zoom out in terms of a historical backdrop of the explosion of science, mathematics, rhetoric, art, the early thinkers, Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Pythagoras, and, what is new that comes in. So rational explanation instead of myths, from Homer, the Odyssey, and other stories. Criticisms, critiquing, traditions is a big part as well that comes in. And Plato's tension between the movement he inherited of obviously everything we've covered and then what he critiques at the same time. So to really understand Plato's intellectual world, it's necessary to, like I said, step back and look at the broader cultural movement unfolding in the Greek world during his lifetime. So this period, like I said, is often called the Greek Enlightenment period. It's not a single school or doctrine of thought. It refers to really widespread information and how people explained reality, organized knowledge, and justified authority. So across the Greek-speaking world, there were new ways of thinking that were emerging. So these developments appeared in, like I said, science, mathematics, etc., and rhetoric. They, also appear in cities spread across Greece, southern Italy, Sicily, and the Asia Minor. So the shared feature of these developments is, like I said, an increased reliance on rational explanation. So people begin to ask not only what happens, but why it happens. So they seek causes, principles, structures that can be examined, that can be obviously discussed. They attempt to explain the world without immediate appeal, like it used to be, to divine stories, to the gods, or maybe inherited authority. In earlier periods, myth, like I said earlier, was a dominant framework for understanding reality. These stories carried authority because they were traditional and they were widely shared. I'm sure you can think to a lot of beliefs now, not to get kind of swayed around, but, religious beliefs that held traditional systems or ways of belief that dominated countries, families, individuals, upbringings. So during this period, explanation took a different form. So we started relying on observation, on reasoning, and an argument. So knowledge became something that can be debated publicly. It wasn't something that, like I said, you were critiquing and, you were not supposed to be. One of the earliest figures in this movement is Thales. So he was a Greek philosopher, and he attempts to explain the natural world by identifying a single underlying principle. So he's the one that proposed that everything originates from water. this is more focused on the method rather than literal accuracy of the claim. Thales treats the universe as intelligible. So he treats it as something that's governed rather than on a whim. And he assumes that reality can be understood through inquiry. So this approach was a significant shift. Heraclitus continues this transformation. He focuses more on change, process, instability. He describes reality as something in constant motion. He emphasizes tension, conflict, and becoming. For Heraclitus, understanding the world requires attention to the patterns of transformation. Parmenides approaches the problem differently. And again, I'm giving you these because these were like obviously the early Greek philosophers, just to give you a little context. So he emphasizes on permanence and being. He argues that genuine reality cannot change, and he treats change as the feature of appearance rather than truth. So Pythagoras introduces another dimension. So him and his followers treat mathematics as really the underlying structure of reality. So numbers, proportion, harmony, they govern the universe, and they apply that thinking mathematically to music, astronomy, and cosmology. So together, these thinkers contribute to a dramatic, really, expansion of intellectual activity. Natural philosophy develops to understand the physical world. Mathematics advances as a tool for uncovering structure. Rhetoric develops, like I mentioned, a big part develops as a systematic study of persuasion. So these ideas circulate across cities. There were these thinkers, they were traveling to different cities, they were teaching, they had schools, they were getting paid, and writing. Thinkers challenged one another openly, claims were obviously examined, and criticisms became a normal feature for intellectual life. So these were all important concepts, obviously, to kind of get the broader landscape of the period, but rhetoric becomes a very powerful tool. So like I mentioned, teachers would travel from city to city to offer instructions on how to speak, how to argue, and how to persuade. So they would train individuals in courts and assemblies and political life. So going back to what I was saying, if you weren't taught in this and you were accused of something and you had to go to court, you were screwed. You got no chance because you don't know how to argue, you don't know how to persuade, you don't know how to represent yourself. There were no lawyers that were representing you. They focused more on effectiveness rather than truth. So this development mattered a lot for Plato because he kind of inherits his entire legacy, intellectually speaking, of the movement. So he inherits the confidence in reason, the tools of argument, the commitment to inquiry, but he also inherits the problems with it, which he later obviously critiques. So he observes that just because you have more knowledge does not automatically mean you're better at judging things or making decisions. Just because you have a high degree of a technical skill of something does not guarantee that you have some kind of moral insight. Persuasive ability often will outpace understanding. So, if we look at the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? There's that graph where at the start, when you're learning something, it all seems very simple and you feel like you know all of it, and you can maybe talk about it to someone and maybe they don't know anything about it, so they just kind of take it as it is. And a lot of people stay at that part. A lot of influential people who have far more views, counts, whatever than I do here making this video in the world, arguably even running countries, are still on that part of the graph. And then what happens is once you start inquiring more about the specific concept, or it could be career, whatever it is, you start to realize you actually don't know much about this at all. And there's a lot more to learn, and you get very unmotivated, maybe. There's a lot of different maybe feelings that you get after realizing there's a lot more to this than you could imagine. And what happens is it just drops, you plummet. Your perceived knowledge of that subject goes from you think you know all of it to, okay, I actually have no idea and I'm way over my depths here. And then you slowly make up to becoming an expert or more just knowledgeable. truly knowledgeable about something. It slowly turns upwards until you get to a certain point where you have not so much confidence, but conviction behind what you're saying, because you've been learning it. So Plato grows up in a world that's saturated with all this information, debate, expertise. So people are arguing with each other and they're practicing and they're learning how to win arguments. So he watches people speak very well, but they don't understand deeply that concept. But the thing is, the problem is crowds, when they're looking at arguments between two people, and again, I'm telling you all this stuff, not a lot has changed since then, funny enough. But when you look at crowds, if you think of debates, right? You've probably seen debates between two individuals and maybe one person's better at arguing than the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that person is right or maybe truthful in what he's saying or she's saying. They just know how to argue better. They know how to put you in traps. They know how to kind of break apart your argument. And maybe the other person actually is truthful in everything they're saying and maybe actually has sought truth in whatever argument there is, but they're just not piecing the overall argument or, presentation of what they're talking about effectively. And what happens is crowds respond to the confidence of someone rather than the wisdom. I'm sure you can also imagine someone who's very good at public speaking, but doesn't actually have a lot of intellectual knowledge of what they're talking about. They're just really good at that. So case in point, I'm sure you can imagine, representatives of certain companies, right? That they probably aren't in the weeds of that company. They're not in the factories. They're not assembling things, but they'll go on, CNN, or they'll go on a TV news network and they'll represent, or they'll have, be at the stock exchange or whatever, and they're taking interview questions and they're answering, but they don't really know. Maybe they do. On the off chance, some of them rarely maybe do. Most of them are just really good at public speaking, and they're effective, they're persuasive, and that's what they get paid the big bucks for. So you can imagine back then, crowds responded to confidence, and education produced cleverness. You became clever, but not virtuous. And that was an important distinction there. So, Plato accepts the Enlightenment period's commitment to reason, of course. He accepts the need for explanation, for argument, critique. That's all great. He accepts the rejection of unexamined tradition. Obviously, that's great. Why are we believing this certain thing? Oh, well, because everybody's believed it for a certain amount and God told us, right? He thinks, no, we should break apart and see what is this. But he also sees, the dangers of it. Whether reason alone is sufficient. Can technical knowledge, can someone who's very technically talented, can they live an ethical life? Does intellectual progress, if we look at it in today's world, with the rise of AI, with the rise of social media technology, does intellectual progress of us learning all these things, does that make us a better human being? Does it ensure moral progress? I'm not sure. It's still a topic we're talking about in today's world. So you can see how much Plato runs through a lot of these questions. So this tension runs through his work quite significantly. And, he tries to distinguish knowledge from opinion, true knowledge, and really ground education in the formation of character rather than the accumulation of just some information. Why societies with advanced knowledge still fail catastrophically. Why does that happen? So those are central threads that kind of emerge within his text, which we'll look at later on. And the Greek Enlightenment, expands human capacity to explain, to calculate, and persuade. But that does not automatically expand the human capacity to judge well. So Plato's philosophy kind of grows out of this realization through his lived experiences. His work becomes an attempt to understand how reason can be disciplined, can be ordered, and oriented toward the good, as he calls it. Shifting from what humans can know to how they should live with what they know. So from this world of expanding knowledge and really unstable judgments, Plato begins this search for obviously just something more meaningful. So we're going to leave it there. There's quite a lot we went through on today's video. What will be next will be talking more in depth about the really rhetoric and persuasion, the sophists, which he had, a lot of criticisms for. So I'll leave it at that. I think we covered a lot of ground here. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, subscribe, share your feedback, share your thoughts. If you've read Plato or if it's your first time, welcome to this video. Again, I want to make these videos just to kind of get everybody's feet wet. I'm no expert either on Plato. I'm just someone that finds it really interesting and kind of want to share it with the world. So yeah, I will see you on the next video.